Hello, I'm Joe from Answers in Reason, and today I'd like to be discussing hypotheses. The word hypothesis is a word I hear thrown around social media a lot, and it's one of those words that never seems to sound quite right to me. So I thought I'd have a look at a bunch of different technical resources and see if I was wrong in my thinking about the way hypothesis is being used. Language is one of those things that is used to convey meaning, so the ultimate goal of any word is to convey a particular meaning to someone. So there's no real wrong definition, but with technical language, there are technically correct ways to use the word. If you think about things like a scientific theory or the theory of evolution and things like that, then they have a proper use. But you can use theory and evolution in colloquial ways. My goal here is to try and reach some understanding of the different types of hypothesis and if any of them really work in the way people are describing their hypothesis. The main problem with people's use of hypothesis is it is a technical term. It's primarily used in science and statistics, so it has that contextually correct definition and set of parameters. What compounds the issue is when people are using the term hypothesis, they are using it, thinking they're using it in the technical way, because that's how they've sort of had it passed down to them in almost meme-like fashion. And this in turn then ends up with them using terms like the Null hypothesis and thinking it applies to their hypothesis. So the most common misconception I see is hypothesis is just an idea or explanation about the world. You can forgive this misunderstanding because actually if you do Google the definition, that is like the basic definition it comes up with. But as with many things, there's a lot more than the headline of anything. You know, if you expect to get all your information about an article from its title, you're probably going to be wrong about your assumptions. It's the same sort of thing with a definition. If you only take a simplistic Google search of a definition, you're probably not going to get the full context. A simple way to break down that definition, though, is it's basically just describing conjecture. If you're using hypothesis in that sort of Google definition way, you're just talking about conjecture, and that isn't really how people want to be using that term. They're not using it thinking they are saying this is just mere conjecture. They're using it thinking they're saying something a little bit more powerful. So to delve deeper, we have to ask, well, what is a hypothesis? Hypothesis is an explanation of an observation of some feature of the natural world or a data set, and it suggests a relationship between two or more variables. The hypothesis, whilst not a prediction in and of itself, has a predictive quality that, if the hypothesis is supported, we can expect to see. A variable is described as an element, feature, or factor that has the ability to change. Programmers, for example, use variables all the time. You can think about it in terms of algebra, your A, B, C. They're all technically variables that are usually filled with numbers, but imagine being able to fill that A, B, C with anything else. So how does that variable fit within a hypothesis framework? It might not be clear what is meant by a relationship between the two variables, but it basically means that if we manipulate one variable, we expect to see a change in another one. If we were to give an example of, a lawn, okay, we'll call this the lawn hypothesis. Let's imagine for a moment that we are in our garden and we look over and we notice that half of our grass is much longer than the other half. You notice that the shorter half is in the shade, and you take some time and you notice throughout the day that the shorter half spends more time in the shade than the other half. Your observation might lead to the thought that, hey, maybe sunlight affects the rate of growth of grass. So this idea is an explanation. Does it qualify as a hypothesis? Well, we have our subject, the grass, and we have our two variables, the amount of sunlight and the rate of growth. If we didn't have these variables, or we poorly framed it like stuff makes grass change, then at best, yeah, that's conjecture. It's not really a hypothesis at that stage. But once you qualify it a little bit more and are a bit more specific, that's when it starts becoming, a hypothesis. Now, you could regard conjecture as a bad or baseless hypothesis, but I would suggest that this might be valuing the use of scientific or technical language a little bit too much and forgetting the actual purpose of it. So even with the simplistic Google definition that we looked at earlier, it does sort of say starting point of investigation. So let me just read that out again. It says, a supposition or proposed explanation made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point for further investigation. So if you don't have those variables, how can you be at the start of an investigation? Right? So even under that simplistic definition, conjecture doesn't actually qualify because it's not really a starting point. It's basically the bit before the starting point, I guess. So with the lawn hypothesis, we also note that it sort of has a predictive quality. If the hypothesis is supported, we would see a change in the rate of growth. Now, we should probably have made our hypothesis more specific. More sunlight increases the rate of growth, for example. So if this is supported, then we would expect an increase in sunlight to be proportional to the increase in the rate of growth. Once we've got these variables and predictions, the result of the prediction not coming true is essentially falsifying that hypothesis. It might mean that we have to refine our hypothesis a bit more, perhaps include various alternative hypotheses and different ways to examine this. Or in some cases, it might just be that, this is the only way that this particular thing might work, so it could be outright proven false. But as we know with sunlight, it can actually be the total amount of sun, and in comparison with other variables like the water and so on. Assuming we don't have this knowledge about, the grass and the sunlight and so on and so forth, we would probably spend some time refining and falsifying each alternative hypothesis until we found something that worked. Or perhaps we would falsify all alternative hypotheses and we'd end up at the null, which we will cover later. Falsification is considered a big part of a credible or valid scientific hypothesis. It's largely agreed that for a hypothesis to be considered valid or credible, or even scientific, it must be falsifiable, at least in principle, especially when discussing a causal hypothesis like sunlight increasing the growth rate. So with the components of your variables and falsifiability, it's then possible to operationalize your hypothesis. So essentially that's designing the test and writing down all the variables and expectations. When we operationalize a concept, we basically turn something fuzzy into something more meaningful. So if we were to review the basic required components of a hypothesis, it's an explanation for some sort of observation. There's at least two variables. We have the ability to manipulate at least one of the variables. There's a sort of predictive quality in there. There's falsifiability in there. and we should have the ability to operationalize it. Strictly speaking, those are the components that make a hypothesis valid or credible, and therefore worthy of investigation. If the only component is an explanation, then it shouldn't really be regarded as a hypothesis. At best, it's a disregarded or weak hypothesis, but really it's just conjecture, an idea, a proposition, maybe even a prediction. There is a bit of a difference between a prediction and a hypothesis. So a prediction is essentially an expected result if a hypothesis or theory is true. So whilst a hypothesis ought to have a predictive quality, a prediction doesn't necessarily qualify as a hypothesis in and of itself. The prediction is something we draw from a hypothesis or theory. So now that we have a bit of a clearer understanding of what is meant by hypothesis and how it ought to be used, let's take a look at the different types of hypothesis. There's an overlap between the different types of hypothesis, and some can be described quite differently, especially in sort of different sciences, though largely they are described in similar ways and have unifying qualities. The causal hypothesis is essentially the main hypothesis spoken about within science. That's basically the lawn example that we covered at the beginning. In fact, it's very rare to hear the term hypothesis used in a scientific context in any other way. This is largely due to what science is for: investigating causal links between natural phenomena. Something is observed, an explanation is proposed, a causal link is looked for. By manipulating an independent variable, we expect to see a change with the dependent variable. The causal hypothetical process would essentially be that initial observation of a phenomenon, and then we sort of ask, well, what caused this? Advancing the causal hypothesis, what had been observed, we then start thinking about the independent variables. We might plan the test of this hypothesis that incorporates some sort of predictive quality, and then we'd conduct the test and compare the results to the prediction. We'd then draw a conclusion as to whether the results of the test support or contradict the hypothesis. And part of the testing obviously would be repeating that test quite a few times so that our data was at least significant, and we could do our best to mitigate any other factors. Though you wouldn't necessarily have to do this for it to be a causal hypothesis, but it would be good science if you made sure that you were repeating your tests. So, some examples of the causal hypothesis. So, assuming we've observed some phenomena. If we increase the amount of caffeine taken, we will increase the activity of a specific group in comparison to a group which has less or no caffeine. If we increase the amount of vegetables a group gets, their weight loss will be improved due to having less room for snacking and better digestive operation. The lawn hypothesis, again, that's an example of the causal hypothesis. The causal hypothesis can actually be split into sort of three hypotheses in a way: the non-directional, the positive direction, and the negative direction. So a non-directional hypothesis does not state the change between the variables. A non-directional hypothesis is proposed when you're not sure what the effect is going to be from manipulating the variables. So you might just say caffeine causes a change in heart rate, because you're not sure whether it's going to increase or decrease it, for example. Eating more vegetables will change the amount of weight that you gain or lose. So on the flip side, you've got your directional hypothesis, and if it's a positive one, you're sort of stating that caffeine causes an increase in the activity level or heart rate, and eating more vegetables increases your weight loss. And the negative is the inverse of that. Caffeine causes a decrease in the heart rate. We then have the relational hypothesis, sometimes known as a correlative hypothesis or associative hypothesis. So a Relational hypothesis looks at the degree of overlap between variables. So instead of looking for a causal link and comparing it against a control group, the relational hypothesis simply looks for correlative qualities. And the more the variables seem to overlap, the stronger the relationship is said to be. The variables are interdependent, that is, manipulating or seeing a change in one affects the other, and vice versa. The closer the associated link, the better the hypothesis. Consider things like the amount of funding a hospital gets versus the wait times or mortality rates, religious upbringing and being in strongly religious areas versus having a good education, and so on. Of course, correlation is not causation. So whilst it can be indicative of a link, sometimes you end up with the sort of thing like the number of people who drown from falling into a pool correlating with the number of films Nicolas Cage has been in. Yeah. And whilst amusing, and this site is hilarious with the correlations it's found, it shows that the correlative hypothesis can be misapplied, and correlation is not causation. So even though this correlation does seem ridiculous, we could technically test it by not letting Nick Cage be in any new roles for a number of years, right? And actually see that if we didn't let him appear on the screen for 3 years, would these rates suddenly drop and become pretty much nothing? Chances are we'd find out that actually no. It's a correlation of complete coincidence rather than being a correlation that is completely valid. Now, I know it would be hard to actually prevent Nicolas Cage from appearing in any film, but he could technically spend the time recording a load of films, and then after that, say, 3-year period, then released at least double the number of films he would usually be in. So where we've got our max number of films at 4. Imagine if it was 8 films a year, and then just see if the correlation then goes back up. So we've got our test of taking the films away and doubling them as well, to see if this correlation still continues. Now, whilst this wouldn't necessarily actually count as fully falsifying the correlative hypothesis, the weaker you make that graph, the less you see that interaction between the variables, the closer you come to saying no, that this correlation is pure coincidence. It's not actually a good correlation. We've weakened the relationship. So enough examples of this weakness and this correlation not happening is enough to potentially reject said correlative hypothesis. Obviously, getting Nick to agree to that would be a whole different ballgame. But if he would be up for it, it'd be actually really cool. He could even do a film about his not appearing in films and seeing if people still died. I wonder if it's in any way to do with that whole dream sequence one, where he keeps on appearing in people's dreams, and they start off where he's not doing anything, and then they start becoming positive, and then they become really scary. Probably not though. There's also the descriptive hypothesis. Now, this descriptive hypothesis is probably better known as a tentative law. It's an observation of a regular occurrence or pattern. Essentially, it's a statement based on induction, like all swans are white. The descriptive hypothesis is probably better not considered a real hypothesis in science, because whilst it is falsifiable in theory, it's not necessarily falsifiable in principle. Consider the black swan observation is only really testable by observing all species around the world, or at least until you find a non-white swan, which was eventually done, but it's not really practical or even possible for an individual to do this, at least with current technology. So the descriptive hypothesis can be built into law, which can then feed into a causal hypothesis and then produce those proper predictive qualities. There are still the variables, again, back to the example of the swan, we've got the color of the swan and the amount of the world that's actually being observed. So whilst the variables are defined and quantifiable, they're not in the same sort of league for the variables of the causal hypothesis. The statistical hypothesis is from which the null hypothesis was born. The statistical hypothesis is a statement about the nature of a population or data set. It's often stated in terms of a population parameter. Statistical hypotheses are probabilistic and are made falsifiable by setting up their rejection parameters. So like the causal hypothesis, it works in relation to a dependent and independent variable, and these are set up to form a null and alternative hypothesis. So the null and alternative hypothesis are things that are also used in science. In fact, when we talk about the statistical hypothesis, the way it operates is pretty much the same as the scientific causal hypothesis. So when I describe the null and alternative, it relates both back to the causal hypothesis and statistical hypothesis, at least very strongly. The alternative hypothesis, or hypotheses, is that sort of HA or H1 to N, and it proposes that there's a significance in the relationship between the variables, whilst the null hypothesis suggests there's no significant relationship between the variables. Significance is something that is decided on at the start of the experiment. There can be a mild sort of causal link that you'd say isn't really indicative of a proper causal link. So the significance quota could be given in a way to allow for a little bit of leeway. Perhaps there isn't quite as much effect as you thought, or if there's not enough effects, then you can discount it, because even though there was a tiny bit of an effect, you're like, well, no, we're discounting that. So if we consider the coffee example, or the non-directional, positive directional, and negative directional are all alternative hypotheses. They all describe a relationship by manipulating the independent variable. That's the quantity of caffeine. So it causes the effect to the dependent variable. That's the heart rate or level of activity. So the null, on the other hand, would be talking about that there was no relationship between the two, or at least no significant relationship. So the more caffeine you have, if there is no or very little change to your heart rate, and the reason you'd have a significance quota there is other things can change your heart rate. Perhaps you stand up, perhaps you read something exciting, perhaps you started falling asleep. All these sorts of things can change your heart rate, so you'd want to have a significance quota, perhaps 10 beats per minute, that you'd ignore based on the caffeine. I suppose it depends how strong the caffeine is as well. So the null, on the other hand, would basically be that there's no significant difference in the heart rate, or there's none at all. So someone drinks caffeine, their heart rate doesn't change, or it changes very little. The reason you might have the significance quota is basically to allow for natural changes in heart rate that might happen just because someone's standing up or read something exciting, or they've been sat down for a while and so their heart rate's dipped, and so on and so forth. Hypotheses can also be separated into groups like simple and complex. A simple hypothesis would be one that has a single dependent and a single independent variable. A complex hypothesis is one with two or more dependent variables and two or more independent variables. So the caffeine on the heart rate example would be explaining a simple hypothesis, but if we were then to add in an additional parameter, for example, amount of sugar and level of perspiration, we'd suddenly have a complex hypothesis because we've got two dependent variables and two independent variables. So when we're discussing the types of hypothesis, There's obviously some overlap, and some of them are technically subsets of hypothesis. For example, the directional or non-directional hypothesis relate to the causal hypothesis and the sort of prediction that we expect to have. Simple and complex relate to the variables in a hypothesis, so that could relate to any, really. The null and alternative hypothesis relate to the relationship between variables. So the directional and non-directional hypotheses are alternative hypotheses, and the null is where there's no significant relationship between those variables. The statistical hypothesis doesn't necessarily get mentioned within the realm of science because that is all brought into the causal hypothesis and how that causal hypothesis works. The associative hypothesis is essentially looking for an overlap between the two variables. It's not necessarily as firm in any way, shape, or form. But those correlations can help us find perhaps some links that we could then throw into a causal paradigm, or perhaps indicate certain areas that we need to look into. And at other times, they're just silly correlations. But with all of those types of hypothesis, we can say that they sort of fit the paradigm of having those variables and could fit into an alternative and null because they are falsifiable and so on and so forth. That said, though, in science, when someone mentions a hypothesis, it's almost guaranteed they are speaking of the causal hypothesis. So just to recap, the fundamental qualities of a hypothesis is that sort of explanation, the variables, the operationalization or testability of it, falsification, and prediction. A hypothesis is supposed to provide an explanation for some sort of natural phenomenon or data set. All of these types of hypotheses all have that relationship between the variables. It requires at least sort of one independent variable and one dependent variable, or two interdependent variables. These variables are quantifiable and measurable, and without having these variables, there can be no null hypothesis, as the null hypothesis isn't merely a negation of the hypothesis, it's there being a lack of a link between the variables. So if you do not have quantifiable, measurable variables, you do not have a null. Whilst a hypothesis isn't strictly a prediction in and of itself, through its sort of exploration, investigation, operationalization, there should be some clear predictions coming out of it. So if this hypothesis is true, we would expect to see this result. A hypothesis has a predictive quality. Now, predictions can extend past hypothesis testing, of course, and they can even be additional explanations. One has, if a particular theory is true. Consider something like the prediction of gravitational waves, long before we ever had the ability to detect them. This was still based on some really good science, though technically it wasn't a hypothesis until it was falsifiable in principle. A fundamental requirement of a hypothesis is that it can be tested against reality and can then be supported or rejected. So when we operationalize a hypothesis, we are essentially designing the experiment we could perform, variables and all. And this would include our acceptance and rejection criteria. Essentially, if we can operationalize a hypothesis, we ought to be able to falsify it too. It isn't really considered operationalized if part of the experiment includes technology that hasn't been invented yet. The doctrine of falsification states that a scientific hypothesis is only considered credible if it is falsifiable, and that means having the ability to be tested and proven wrong. The doctrine is also considered a core part of the scientific method, especially in relation to the statistical hypothesis. If I proposed a green monkey that gives AIDS to all those who don't pray to it, even though it was an explanation of a natural phenomenon, it has neither the variables nor the ability to be falsified. The doctrine doesn't really work when we get to the limit of our ability to test. I mean, if we consider string theory, we have no way of actually detecting these tiny strings, but the math checks out. The inquiry has still been a scientific one. It doesn't suddenly become pseudoscience because it's not testable or falsifiable, but at least for now it's a bit of a dead end. This is why string theory, even though named theory, isn't even considered a hypothesis by some people. It's considered a strong hypothetical idea that could one day be built into a theory of everything. So, falsification isn't a strict demarcation of science versus pseudoscience in the way Popper seemingly wanted, but it is indicative of whether something is a credible hypothesis or not. If there isn't a body of supporting scientific information to make deductions and predictions from, the lack of falsifiability would indicate that the statement is mere conjecture, whereas one that has been built on through loads of science and we're just at the limit of our ability to test, then it's still a scientific idea. It's not just mere conjecture. So what would we call a non-falsifiable hypothesis? If a hypothesis is a supposition or proposed explanation made on the basis of limited evidence that proposes a relationship between two or more variables as a starting point for further investigation and is usually tentative and subject to testing and then revision based on new data, what do we call an explanation that does not fit these criteria? If a proposed explanation does not meet these criteria, it might be regarded as a non-falsifiable hypothesis, as it cannot be tested or proven false by any observation or physical experiment. Therefore, it does not count as a scientific hypothesis. It's basically mere conjecture or assumption or a belief. If a hypothesis is not falsifiable and or does not have at least two quantifiable variables with a proposed relationship, then it also doesn't fit into that paradigm of null and alternative hypothesis. If you wanted to have non-falsifiable hypotheses, you could have things like chocolate is always better than vanilla. That's purely subjective. It's down to a personal preference. The only person that you could prove that wrong to is yourself. For example, anyone from the UK can go to America and order a Hershey's bar and realize that, yes, in some instances, vanilla is better. There is a teapot orbiting between Earth and Mars. I mean, that's technically untestable. With current technologies, I suppose we could send a satellite out and try and investigate it in some way. But largely speaking, it's something that none of us can actually test, so it's not really a good hypothesis. God exists. That's just a metaphysical claim. It doesn't fit the paradigm of a valid hypothesis. So it's, if you want, a non-falsifiable hypothesis and therefore does not relate to the alternative and null. And the problem there is you will then find people talking about these sorts of things as valid hypotheses and as if they do relate to some form of null hypothesis, and they will say the null hypothesis is perhaps the negation of one of those things, which again, the null is not exactly the negation of any hypothesis. It's there being no relation between the two. The question then comes, why would anyone call an explanation that doesn't have the normal qualities of a hypothesis, for example, the predictive qualities, the variables, the ability to be tested and falsified and so on, a hypothesis at all? Like there's a difference between a scientific theory and the colloquial use of theory, which just means an idea, or there's a difference between how we might be talking about evolution in the sense of biological evolution, or just the evolution of my ideas, which is just talking about my ideas changing over time. There is a difference between all the types of hypothesis mentioned, especially when it comes to the scientific or causal hypothesis. Like there's a difference between a scientific theory and the colloquial use of theory, which is just an idea, or perhaps how biological evolution is quite different to how I might say, oh, my ideas have evolved, which just means they've changed over time. There is also a significant difference between all those types of hypotheses mentioned, especially the scientific or causal hypothesis, and the non-falsifiable hypothesis, which is basically mere conjecture or an assumption or a belief. The main issue isn't so much the colloquialism or overly broad use, but it's the use of technical language in a vague way, as if it is the same as a scientific hypothesis, or even one of the other types, and therefore, because it's one of these more technical types of hypothesis, it then has its null. But of course, it doesn't fit the paradigm of one of these hypotheses, so it doesn't have an alternative and a null. To try and bring it all back together, there's a variety of different types of hypotheses. They overlap in a lot of their qualities, but they also describe quite different concepts as well within sort of the whole hypothesis paradigm. When it comes to science, the causal hypothesis, inclusive of all of its directions and nulls and so on and so forth, is what is meant by hypothesis, and that's because we're sort of looking for explanations, causes, how and why from our observations. The descriptive hypothesis is sometimes used in science, but it's better regarded as a tentative law, and as that sort of more accurately describes what it is. All the different types of hypothesis mentioned have these predictive qualities. Consider how, outside of the colloquial use of hypothesis, that non-falsifiable hypothesis, if you will, they all contain variables and operate in a way that seems to give the ability to have an alternative and null. So if you propose a hypothesis without any of those clearly defined variables, then you don't really have an alternative and a null. So if you refer to this as a hypothesis, you're not really using it in the way hypotheses are usually thought of. Hypothesizing something isn't necessarily the same as formulating a hypothesis, though it is what leads there, much in the same way, thinking about what I might have for dinner tonight isn't the same as making dinner. Hopefully that's helped explain what a hypothesis is and the different types of hypotheses, and perhaps the problem with using the term hypothesis far too freely outside of one of its technical contexts. Perhaps if you see someone using the term hypothesis, you can ask them what their variables are, and if they don't have any. In production of this video and the article I wrote before producing this video, I spoke to a lot of people who work in the field of science and also did as much research as I can around the web. I've included some of my references because they were the ones that were still open after a browser crash. Anyway, hopefully you found it somewhat informative and learned something from it. But let me know what you think. Have a good one.